I think the big trend in Brazil that's negative, that has really impacted where Brazilian credit trades, is the lack of structural reform. And I think what we've been doing a lot of is contrasting that with Mexico, where you have a pretty consistent 20-year pattern of structural reform, and Mexico has been delivering on promises actually faster than expected. And I think what happened is early in the PT administration, Lula had a great mix between spending and being pragmatic on the fiscal side. And somewhere down the line, that completely went out the window. And so what the government is doing today is basically giveaway programs that has caused the fiscal deficit to explode. And so I think that the biggest headwind that Brazil faces is that very thing, and the lack of credibility. Because if you look across macroeconomic indicators in Brazil today, what you can see is a profound deterioration in the fiscal climate. Debt is going up, which I think a lot of the Brazilian success story really hinged on the idea that they had reduced their debt. And what had really happened is, while sovereign debt went down, they were just refinancing it on the quasi-sovereign side. And so you saw issuers like Petrobras or BNDES or Eletrobras, all of them just exploded in the volume of debt they had in the international capital markets. And that's the key trend that I think we need to see some sort of reversal in. So right now what we're trying to ascertain is 2015 the trough year, or is 2015 the first in a series of bad years? Because when the Undersecretary of Finance was speaking earlier today, and he put up the macro indicators, it's still kind of shocking to see how much of a deviation Brazil has taken from its path established over the last decade. So I think it really hinges on the government's ability to deliver on their promises. And this impacts everything down the curve. So whether it's sovereign debt in the dollar market or in the real market, or corporate debt in the dollar or real market, I think you need to see the government be able to deliver on reversing its course and establishing a fair, level, and consistent playing field. And that's the problem that Brazil has, is that the rules are subject to interpretation. And there's a great example of it in the ethanol sector. If you look at the great, one little microcosm of the Brazilian success story is that they engineered this flex fuel engine. You can go to any gas pump in the country, you can fill up with unleaded, or you can fill up with ethanol. The government touted this as one of their success stories, and then the government literally undermined the whole pricing environment of the fuel sector by dictating that Petrobras preserved prices while oil prices went up and the real appreciated. And that negatively impacted the ethanol sector. And so today we have an entire sector that's effectively bankrupt and over a barrel. And the problem that Brazil faces is that there's not a good, consistently interpreted bankruptcy law in place that creditors can rely upon. And so I think that the headwind that Brazil faces, if you take that little microcosm and apply it more broadly, is that the government consistently, achieves these success stories but fails to maintain the policies in place that got them where they are. And I think that there's a lot of risk right now with respect to Petrobras, which has historically been very willing to honor contracts. Petrobras very clearly has to cut its capital expenditure budget, and that has negative ramifications throughout the economy. There's a lot of Petrobras has a spider web of relationships with suppliers, customers, and everybody in the economy, and really has the most far-reaching impact of any single company, I would say Petrobras and BNDES combined. I'd like to see, in the context of Brazil, is more respect for precedent and more willingness to establish a precedent that could be followed. So in 2005, Brazil implemented a new bankruptcy law. That bankruptcy law needs to be a living, breathing thing, and it needs to develop. And the problem that Brazil faces today from a creditor perspective is no companies have really exited bankruptcy. There's not a successful case study that you can hold up and say, here it is. Whereas there's about 10 disaster stories. And there needs to be a sophisticated court that everybody goes to for bankruptcy, as opposed to getting relegated to these provincial courts that the guy's ruling on a divorce one minute and $100 million bankruptcy the next minute. It's just absurd. Needs to have a system like Delaware or New York courts where we can know that there's a sophisticated judge that understands the nuances of the case. That's a major reform that needs to take place for the benefit of creditors. Clearly, we need to know that there's some end of the line in the Lava Jato scandal, and I think that the problem that the government has is that could very well reach all the way to the top. I think as it continues to kind of percolate through the system, I would worry that more and more people get embroiled in it. And the problem that we have today is when they went to pick a new CEO for Petrobras, they didn't go outside and pick somebody from the private sector. They went internal and they picked somebody from the public sector. And that, to me, sends a signal that the government isn't quite getting it. And I'd like to see that they get it. I think Brazil has a very interesting domestic dynamic in that they have the highest real interest rates in the world. And that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in the sense that you have a big liquid market. It's a curse in the sense that that market is wholly sovereign and there's no diversification. So Brazil has a very kind of old boys club in the local market that's dominated by about 5 or 6 local banks. Longer term, one of the reforms that needs to happen is there needs to be more diversity among not only underwriters but investors as well. And there needs to be better development of the real market for corporate debt. What we've seen is there's a great success story in the dollar bond market where you saw sovereign debt decline and corporate debt go up. So basically the sovereign borrower used to crowd corporates out, and as sovereign borrowing needs declined because fiscal deficit declined, so the corporates were able to access the market in a better way. And so I think that that's a great success story that you can point to. And I think if you just interpret the last couple years and the next 2 years as kind of a soft spot, you want to see that trend correct and you want to see the local market become more vibrant. But I think the main thing that I've tried to convey is Brazil's cheap right now, and it's cheap for a reason. And we don't know decisively that they've turned the corner. I think from an audience perspective, there's a great diversity of the audience. I mean, you get issuers, underwriters, and investors, and you get senior level people that are all in the room together talking to each other. It's a great conference in that you can walk around and you see a lot of familiar faces. You're never really at a loss for someone to talk to. And so I think those types of things and the ancillary meetings that take place around it are really beneficial, whether they're one-on-one meetings with the issuers or going out and kind of visiting with people outside of the conference. But it's a great opportunity to see kind of the Brazilian market as a whole.